Hi everybody, welcome to our Facebook Live event. Today we're going to be focusing on International Overdose Awareness Day that's coming up at the end of the month, and we're going to take some time to talk about loss due to overdose. As always, we welcome your comments, your questions, and I want to get right to it and welcome Sarah Montgomery, who is one of the counselors at the Chesapeake Life Center. She's a licensed clinical social worker, and she's going to spend some time with me today to talk about why and how overdose loss is different and what sort of we can do when we know someone that's had that type of loss, and then what kind of resources there are available for that type of loss. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, losing anyone, we've talked about this before, grief, losing someone is just a challenge. It's a really difficult process to go through.
Yeah.
When somebody loses someone to an overdose, I can't even imagine that type of loss and what that struggle is. Can you kind of share with me what's a little bit different about that?
It's a really good question. Heartbreaking and hard to kind of integrate and understand, but there's something about overdose loss that has kind of another layer. There's a term called disenfranchised grief that is used kind of in the field, and it's a grief that is not as socially acceptable, that may be a little more awkward to talk about, or that people tiptoe around. And certainly overdose loss almost always falls under the category of disenfranchised grief. Often with overdose loss, not often but not always, there's been a struggle prior to the death of your loved one, perhaps struggling with substance use disorder, sometimes in and out of treatment. You get hopeful that this is it, we got it, we've beaten this disease, we've beaten this addiction, and then disappointments when there is a relapse. And relapse is very common in substance use.
That's a total roller coaster.
Yes, 90% actually is what is kind of put out there. And so already after when someone died by overdose, there may have been an ambiguous loss, this transition time of trying to, he's there, she's there, but not there. What can I count on, what can't? So there's an exhaustion often coming into that.
Does that loss sort of play into account too, because the person, when they're suffering or struggling with addiction, you've lost the person that you know, like that. I would imagine that their personality changes, their behavior changes, like everything changes. So that ambiguous loss probably starts, I would think, pretty early in the process.
Absolutely, and it can be little bits at a time, and then your person that you love does show up, and then they're not. So they're often kind of physically there, but maybe emotionally and otherwise not always there, and that's so hard. And so often there is this ambiguous loss before a death loss. Not always. Sometimes it is a sudden, unexpected loss, but it's also overdose. Sometimes we worry about what are people going to say. Are they going to define our loved one based on their cause of death? And people are way more than how they died or the illness that they struggled with. And so that's so important, especially I think that's the importance of groups and meeting others who've had a loved one die by an overdose, because you can take off that mask, you can be authentic and unapologetic. This was the person I love. This is who he was, who he is. Yes, this is how he or she died, but it's not their essence.
Right. I'm sure some of the reactions and some of the emotions even that someone who has lost a person due to overdose is feeling are kind of different than maybe a different type of loss, because as we're talking about, you have that ambiguous loss to begin with. You've struggled for possibly a long time with the in and out of rehab and the addiction itself. I'm thinking there could be relief, there could be guilt because you feel the relief. There seems to be a lot of emotions that probably are tangled in there.
Yeah, tangled is a good word. I think no matter what, it's a heartbreaking loss. no matter, because you always have hope that your person will be able to kind of conquer this illness and be who they were born to be, who their essence was. If relief comes up, sometimes folks need to understand it's not a relief that the person that you love died, it's a relief that that part of the struggle is over. And to really differentiate those,
really
to pull those apart, because it's not about relief that they died, but it's maybe relief that you're not awake every night waiting for a phone call or waiting for a knock on the door. So that's something that we can be aware of when we support those who've lost a loved one. I think there's a lot of what ifs. Could I have done this better? Was I good enough mom? Was I good enough friend? Was I good enough sibling? And there's self-question, sometimes self-blame, that really needs to be aired. It's not other people's fault, but often people hold that. Could I have changed the outcome? And so again, meeting with others who also have some of those questions, and I can realize, wow, you're an amazing mom, and I know it's not your fault, so maybe it's not my fault. Maybe I did all I could do as a human being. And so there are these levels of struggles that we may not see in other kinds of illnesses and deaths. Yeah.
So I think too, what you were just saying, sometimes saying those words out loud, and especially in a group where people understand and there's the judgment isn't there. Sometimes for me, when you say the words out loud, it kind of takes the power away from them, and it just kind of helps move through.
Absolutely, because I think there's all of us as humans have veiled realities. We all kind of share different things with different people, but when someone you care about struggles with substance abuse, there's often a veil around that, like whose story is it to tell? Will people judge the person I love based on, so maybe I'll keep it private. But to be able to say in a group where you know that there's no judgment, it's all support, that people understand, can be really just opening, and it won't ever take away the pain, but it can help you bear the pain. It can make it bearable.
What are some things, we've talked about this a little bit just right now, that support groups that can really help somebody that's going through this type of loss? Are there other types of activities or anything that's specific to help that type of grief? Like, is it art or journaling or anything like that? I'm curious if there's different modalities or things that might help.
I think that's a question that would probably apply to most different kind of griefs, is to find what allows you to express. For some people it's running. For some people it's art. For some people it's going and speaking and sharing their story. But to take what's in here and bring it out here, I think is so important for kids and adults. That we want anything that's pushed down to come out, and to kind of find your way.
So for those of you that might just be joining our conversation, we're talking today about loss due to overdose and how that grief is different than other types of grief. And Sarah, who is a licensed clinical social worker with the Chesapeake Life Center, has been sharing a little bit about disenfranchised grief and sort of the meaning of that. You mentioned children. I would think that adds a whole nother layer. If it's a parent that has died due to an overdose, what type of support or help would really benefit the child? Are there resources or anything that you could speak to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Children are part of the context of the family. So for parents who may have had a partner, someone else die of an overdose, but are also supporting kids, the best thing we say is putting on your oxygen mask first. So a parent who's lost a partner to go get their support, because kids look at the remaining parent as a guide. But with that said, meeting with a counselor, support groups, helping kids find the language. We worked with one girl who's wonderful, who she knew her dad died of an addiction, and she decided that she was going to write a letter to drugs. Dear drugs, I don't like you drugs. This is what you did to my dad, and this is what you've done to others. But give opportunity to express it and to help them separate the disease. And it's a complicated disease because it's a disease that can make people do things that are contrary to their own essence, but separating the disease from the person. So with this young person, and there's a neat video, What's Your Grief, that she did, but helping her express her anger towards the drugs, and then able to then pick up the remembrance of her dad and miss him as what he was and who he could have been if drugs weren't involved.
That has to be really powerful.
Yeah,
like,
very.
What a great way to be able to express that.
Yes. Wow. Yeah, and even using terms like drugs are kind of like a kind of hijack a brain, and it makes brains do things that the heart doesn't really want to do, and that your dad's heart still worked, he still loved you, but his brain that was kind of hijacked or taken by a claw wasn't working, and so they can know they were still loved even though their parent or loved one wasn't always acting that way.
That's a really good, I'm sure that's really helpful too, for kids to sort of, and for anybody, to kind of break it down that way, because it's very true. You hear a lot of times, addiction's a brain disease. It's, it's definitely, that's an important distinction to make.
And a brain disease that can make people say or do things that aren't always kind or safe. Yeah.
So I want to make sure that I say things that we are referencing, speaking about, we'll make sure to include links and address. So What's Your Grief is a great online resource. If Sarah mentions any others, we'll make sure that we include them. We'll be sure to include information about the Chesapeake Life Center when we get to that part. But I think because overdose and addiction has become really prevalent in most communities, nationwide, internationally, most of us probably know someone or have at least, in some degree, have known somebody who has died due to overdose. In situations like that, can you offer any suggestions on what we should do, what we shouldn't do, like if it's just happened recently? I'm sure folks sometimes might be struggling with what to say and how to say it.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the most important to remember is they were a person who had wonder and possibility inside, and to share that if you have a memory of them as a student or on the soccer field or as a coworker, to share that. I love seeing your son helping my children in first grade, or so sharing that you remember them
for who they were,
to reach out. There's not one size fits all, but certainly reaching out and being patient. It's going to take time for the person who's grieving. Some people are more private, some people are less private, to kind of help read them and be patient and just walk alongside them and keep the door open. And it may be that the grieving person knocks on your door. You may knock on their door, like not literal door, but figurative door. But be patient and to share your kindness and your care and concern, and that you're thinking about them. Even shooting a text, I'm thinking about you today, goes a long way.
Without the expectation of anything.
Absolutely.
In return.
Absolutely.
I don't need to hear back from you. I'm just thinking
about you. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting part with grief overall, that a lot of people feel like they can't say the person's name who's died. I think that's a misconception for a lot of folks.
Good point.
That, you're going to make the person upset if you bring up the person that's passed away, or if you mention them. And it's quite opposite.
The upset is already in the griever person. You're not creating it. They're creating it because they've lost someone who's dear and integral in their life. So unless you hear otherwise from the person, and to say their name, like was thinking of John today when I was fishing, or I was thinking of Mary the other day when I was eating Italian food, because I know how much she loved Italian food. Absolutely. I think, and again, not always not a one size fits all, but more often than not, hearing the name and knowing that they were being thought of is so important.
And then just kind of the expectation of the person that's sharing that or saying that to the person, just keeping that expectation in check, that
Yes.
you might not hear back from the person,
Yes.
but
Yes.
it's just the letting them know
Yes.
part that's important.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
So specifically through the Chesapeake Life Center, I know there are a couple of support groups. We mentioned that's a really powerful
Yes.
resource
Yeah.
for those that have lost somebody due to overdose.
Mhm.
Can you share a little bit about what's offered in both Anne Arundel and Prince George's
Yeah.
County?
So we have a group for adults 18 and over. It's a monthly group here. It meets one Monday evening a month, and it's for adults who've lost a loved one to struggles with addiction or overdose. And it's a wonderful group. Again, you can just be authentic and kind of share who you are, and you can talk or not talk. And everyone there, again, has lost someone. And so you're bringing your vulnerability in, and the facilitator kind of helps protect the vulnerability, kind of helps create a safe place. For that, you would call the Chesapeake Life Center and do a quick, either a phone meeting or in-person meeting prior to the first group.
Okay.
And that's at no cost, and that one's actually grant run. A lot of our groups are $10 a group, but this one there's no fee, but you do need to call ahead and register. And then we are also starting one in PG County, a sudden loss support group. So that would be any sudden loss, including an overdose loss.
Okay.
But that would also include other sudden loss, motor vehicle, and sudden losses in general have a certain commonality of that shock and fear and kind of often hypervigilance after that. So both of those are offerings I think could be really, really helpful. And then also some people, for instance, if you've lost a child to an overdose, you could also come to our child loss group, which focuses on the relationship more than the cause of death, while the Together Silent No More one focuses on the cause of death and what that means to you more than whether it's a sibling.
Relationship.
Yes. So we have a number of different kinds of groups.
Okay. So what Sarah was mentioning, if you want to get more information, you can email griefinfo@chesapeakelifecenter.org. We'll link the phone number. It's 888-501-7077. But we'll make sure we have all that in our comments and make sure that you guys have all those resources available. I did want to mention we started off when we first started talking about it being International Overdose Awareness Day, and in Anne Arundel County, Recovery Anne Arundel is going to be hosting a candlelight vigil on Friday, this Friday the 30th at 7 p.m. at the Arundel Christian Church in Glen Burnie. So for anyone that might have lost someone in this at any point, but if you're local to Anne Arundel County and would like to attend that, it's open to the public. We'll again share that information on our Facebook page. And I think, I don't know that we touched on this, but remembering and sort of moving through the stigma and you know, kind of honoring that person is important.
Absolutely.
As part of going through this process.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the word stigma, because I think the stigma's lessening, but there continues to be stigma. And so anything that we can help to minimize the stigma by speaking out loud and sharing our story and sharing resources, I think it's really helpful.
So one other resource I wanted to mention was this PDF pamphlet that you have.
So my colleagues and I last year wrote a pamphlet called Supporting Children After a Drug-Related Loss, and the PDF is available at no cost should you be interested in it, and then these I think are available at cost, which is a couple dollars each. But these are just a kind of beginning kind of platform of how do we talk to children about overdose loss, what kind of language do we use, what to expect, how can we guide the young people in our lives after an overdose loss. We also have groups. We don't have groups specifically for overdose loss in children here, but we have general grief groups, and certainly someone who's lost, and we have a number of kids who've lost a loved one to a substance abuse disorder can come to the group as well.
For those children.
Yes, for the children, exactly.
Okay. So again, if you're interested in that resource, it's griefinfo@chesapeakelifecenter.org. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. I think this is such an important topic.
It is.
I'm really grateful that you were able to share some resources and information.
Thank you so much for having me
Yeah,
here.
thanks for being here. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions after the fact, you can still reach out to us, and we appreciate you tuning in.